Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Assistant Professor at Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Women's Writing and Women's Lives. In this module, we are going to first raise the question why women's writing and women's life is important to understand, especially in the context of gender. And as we know that this module has been written by Professor Vidyut Bhagwat, a foremost feminist thinker in India. There will be a section on reflection of her own journey. Further, using this idea of women writing, she would also understand how regional social history can be constructed, and through it an understanding of feminism and in terms of power and inequality could be understood. The module would also focus on Bhakti literature and women's writing and women's life. Further, using the contemporary interpretation of women's writing of the past, the module will also focus on Maharashtra and women's writing. Section 1. Why women writing and women's lives? When we get introduced to women's writing not only as literature but as a social document, we enter into the realm of feminist understanding of women's expressions, especially through their creative writings. Any written literature of women, and in fact oral expressions of women through OVs, abhangas, which have come to us through many centuries, can be read as texts of women's reflections on their lives in their times. We should not look at the category of women with an uncontested, uncritical gaze, but we have to keep in mind that when women decide to express themselves creatively, orally or in written ways, there is some resistance and some alliance, some interest groups, politics and some genuine concern for the whole humanity. And women's writing shows us that this writing has a vision of their own. Their imaginations, their dreams, aspirations are not only confined to cooking and cleaning and nurturance and maintenance, though these are important areas of women's writings, but these writings directly or indirectly do comment upon the public sphere that is around them. Hence, it is very important to reread the past literature with contemporary feminist lens, which takes us into transformative politics. If we accept feminism as a political consciousness which tries to bring transformation in society ideologically and structurally, then we also understand that in the human society, in every epoch, power relations between men and women become specific and diverse. Inequality between men and women, which is based on sexual difference, is not natural and it gets constructed in human culture. Caste, race, class, religion, all these structures, when they get constructed, patriarchy is also a structure and ideology which gets constructed. Hence, patriarchy and gender are both constructed through women's sexual, social, economic, labor appropriation. The value of system of any society has male dominance as a superstructure, and women also internalize the same. In this situation, how women's self-consciousness or consciousness of meanness gets constructed is a complex quest, and we can look at women's literature to understand this process. Whatever women write can be reread and reinterpreted with the feminist consciousness, but when this writing talks about women's existence and search for totality of herself, we would call this expression as creative literature. Through writing, if women writers applaud only agency of women or victimization of women, we will not be able to see it as a creative literature. But if any writing by women tries to demystify women's body, if they try to bring out oppressiveness that creates victimization, and if any situation fractures body and mind of any woman, and it is written in the short story form or poem form, we can say that women writing is commenting about their situation in a critical way. Three major studies on women's images, Literally Women, Ellen Moore's A Literature of Their Own, Ellen Showalter and Mad Woman in the Attic, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guber are important for students to understand the trajectory of women's writing. Section 2. My own journey. Friends, let us now turn to my own journey. As a daughter born in a family with middle-class aspirations, the boys were sent to science and technology, and I was put into literature that took a combination Marathi-Sanskrit. All this was seen as natural and given. Finish your BA and get married to a foreign settled engineer or doctor, and then while raising your children in UK and USA, your literature background will help you to protect our culture. So said my parents and elders. Looking back at this life plan, trap set for me by people around me, I can see Now, both how in my caste and class location this was seen as the most suitable path, and how women alter, evade or overthrow such life paths set for them. I evaded this trap of studying literature to protect our culture by reading literature in a creative and innovative manner and using the new space of conjugality that love and intercaste marriages were opening up in the Nehruvian era. Of course, marrying into a Brahmin progressive family living in the heart of Mumbai metropolis with writers of children's literature and producers of new mass-mediated women's program, the family had good cultural capital. Marriage provided the space for pursuing my studies in literature, to read, to write, thus complete my post-graduation in Marathi literature. In 1967, we studied literature in a compartmentalized descriptive manner, treating all that was pre-colonial as medieval and bhakti, colonial as Marathi prose reborn with English incarnation, and thus modernity in Marathi literature was seen as a gift of the European Enlightenment. Studying and reading different literary texts several times remained at a verbal level, and a sense of creative discovery was lost in this process. The history of Marathi literature then became a matter of memorizing without contextualizing historical sages in the political economies that were shaping them. I felt vacuous and uneasy when I completed my studies and immediately joined as a part-time lecturer in the Anjuman Khairul Islam's Pune College, because I truly wanted to become a teacher and wanted to be connected with the students' community. Increasingly through this new job, I could see myself as a teacher. My students were all from poverty-stricken families, particularly Muslim families, who had to learn different Marathis and the cultures that go with it. The students were mostly migrants from drought-prone rural areas and were from the newly migrated working-class families in Pune city. Marathi literary texts which were taught to these students invariably needed decoding at various levels. Awareness towards standardization of Marathi language and its relation to the dialects like Dakhini, which my students spoke at homes, took me towards doing more research in language and linguistics. Marathi literary texts that I was handling as a teacher seemed far away from the everyday life of these students. These students energized me to transform received understanding and to read further, to interrogate canons. I wanted my students to think creatively and critically. This was the period of the magical 70s, where the new movements and collectives were emerging, and as a part of many of these initiatives, I began to more seriously and historically pursue questions of domesticity, housewifery, motherhood and companionate marriage. Dalit literature at that time provided moral stamina to encounter literary studies with many questions and interrogations. Here we must note that in the late 1980s, I participated in the project of documenting women's writing in India from different regional languages under the guidance and editorship of Susi Tharu and K. Lalita. The 2 volumes were published by the New York Feminist Press, but what was more enriching was the search for women writing, efforts to delineate not a unilinear but a meaningful tradition of the same became a preparatory ground for much research in the 1990s. The work on the 2 volumes in the Women Writing in India put together anthology taught us many things. We did not want to claim that women's writing was unique and special. We wanted to see why it was different and why it called for special attention. At one level, women writers are as much as victims of social ideologies about the subordinate status of women as men writers. We also did not want to argue on behalf of the women writers and suggest that the work is misrepresented or misjudged and overall they are marginalized in the field of writing. While working on this project, we as a group formed our answers in a tentative and a complex way. We should also think about women writers in the same way. They are part of the times and the society, and at the same time they are also reflective on the crises and suffocations that they face while becoming writers. Section 3. Women Writing and Regional Social History. In this module, we will take some of the Marathi women writers and their lives as examples of how we read literature and as a social document to have a sense of social history of the region. Women's writing in every language needs to be studied against the grain of the text, and when we learn to read between the lines of these texts, we will be able to locate women's subordinate status in the society and how they resist and create a space for themselves, and at the same time create the collectivity and community and make knowledge making possible for themselves. and how they create a gendered form of knowledge and redefine the world of their times. Section 4. Bhakti literature as women writing and women's lives. After a prolonged neglect by the Indian as well as Western intellectuals, the Bhakti tradition is at last getting the necessary critical attention, both as a part of this newly found interest in general due to the impact of the post-1975 women's movement and the women's studies programs. A good body of work on the Bhakta women, particularly Sant women, is now being published. The search by contemporary feminism in India for indigenous roots and mobilization of the Bhakta women's poetry to fulfill this need is one such effort. It is fraught with several dilemmas. Nonetheless, one could see it as a part of a pattern in a range of fields in post-independence India which have turned the searchlight on past traditions in the quest for an identity. Spanning a period of over 5 centuries, the Bhakti tradition in Maharashtra began with a generation of sons like Dhyanadeva, Namdev, Muktabai and Janabai and reached its zenith with Tukaram and Bahinabai. Spread and impact covered the entire space of political, economic, culture and language occupied by the Marathi-speaking world and included even parts of Karnataka and Andhra. The sons entered almost every home through Vithoba, a domestic deity par excellence. Sons were very much a part of the peasant communities of the time. Jayant Lele notes that they were a community of active producers. Gyaneshwar explicitly rejects the renunciation of productive life and ridicules the claims of liberation through rejection of activity. The women of the period, especially those who were in search of creativity and freedom, realized that the doors of the Varkari Sampradaya were open to them. Ekar Ramanujan clarifies that there are many kinds of bhakti, though we speak of it in singular. One way of looking at Bhakti movements is to see them as a counter system opposed to classical orthodox systems, say in their views about caste, gender or idea of God. For example, the Vedic gods are not localized, but in Bhakti they are worshipped in local forms in temples. The gods are as human as they are divine. Bhakti in Maharashtra has always remained a mainstream movement of peasants and artisans, offering a most potent source of the critique of Brahmanism. If we look at the variations in the expression of Bhakti, North India produced Nirguna, abstract Bhakti, where South India adopted Saguna, concrete Bhakti. Maharashtra represented the confluence of the northern and the southern traditions. One of the striking features in this context is the range of caste and occupations that came together within the Varkari Sampradaya. Their articulations were in the idiom of the caste-based occupation, their everyday life practices. Sena Navi, a barber, would carry his critique of caste discrimination by upholding his occupational skill. We are the barbers, we do hajamat minutely. Gora Kumbhar was from the potter community, Safta was a gardener, Chokha Mela was a mahar, Narhari was a goldsmith, Bahira came from Jatved, Jagannath from the Vadabal subcaste. Gyaneshwar and his sister Muktabai belonged to the excommunicated Brahmin family. Namdev was from the Shimpi caste. His disciple Janabai from a Shudra caste was a part of Namdev's household as a bonded domestic servant. The community of sense in Maharashtra therefore was from the artisan and service jatis, and the Bhakta community included both men and women from the higher and the lower caste. The crucial feature of this formation therefore was the fact that every caste contributed its knowledge building process on equal terms. Right from Dhyaneshwar, all saints talk to him in a conversational mode. For Janabai, he becomes a helpmate in carrying domestic chores. Vithoba was no doubt a homely god. Varkari Sampradaya built up a strong egalitarian, democratizing, anti-hierarchical ethos of Vithoba Bhakti. Celebrating earthly joys, the Bhakti had a robust peasant and directness of expression. Almost in recent times, women Bhakti's writings were more often than not studied only in terms of literary expressions. The rigorous critique developed by them to challenge all kinds of caste and gender additional hegemonies were either altogether neglected or pushed into the background. In reality, Varkari women had dared to enter the Varkari movement as equal partners. They drew fearlessly from the domestic life world and wasted no opportunity to challenge the unequal order that subordinated them. We have a long line of women's sense full of radical intent, critique and expression. Mahadaisa, Baisa, Ausa and then Muktabai and Janabai, Soraya, Nirmala, Shaku, Premabai and Bahinabai. From the 13th to the 17th centuries, there is an uninterrupted tradition of radical women saints and Sant poets. Some of the writings of Sant women were translated and printed in the early 20th century. For example, Justin Abbott's preface mentions that the first printed edition of the 17th century Sant Poetess. Bahanabai's work was edited by Dono Umar Khane, which appeared in 1914 and was soon out of print. Eventually, in 1929, Justin Abbott published a translation of the chosen portions of her autobiography to introduce to the West a name there absolutely unknown but worthy of being known, as seemed best adapted to give to the English reader the thoughts of this Indian woman that found expression in verses nearly 300 years ago. It would be apt to say that this writing of woman's sense was seen for a long time, in fact up to 1975, only as a part of the spiritual realm, and women's sons like Muktabai and Janabai were treated as women who had already transcended the physiological division of humans into man and woman. But in this process it was ignored that women's sense were very much a symbiotic part of the Warkari masses. They were also a part of the social historic reality of the Marathi speaking region. After the rise of the women's movement in India, gender-sensitive academic and political discourses made conscious efforts to write women into history. Initially, women's sons were treated as add-on to the list of the male sons. Muktabai, Dhyaneshwar's sister, was designated at one level as Mahayogini, highlighting a spiritual status, but her very complex writing is yet to be analyzed seriously. Thus, these historical accounts did not recognize the agency of women's sons. However, mainstream history was preoccupied with women in early India as enjoying a high status, a position of honor and dignity. This homogenization had created a category of women in India, with Gargi and Maitri being seen as exceptional women seers and knowledge makers. The predominance of this homogenized category further blurred the agency of Sant women of the medieval period. Their expressions were relegated to the sphere of bhakti as only devotion, contrasted to the sphere of knowledge. Women's lives as well as writings were either not contextualized or rendered a tokenist treatment. There has been serious controversies as to whether there was one Dhyaneshwar or two. Namdev is acknowledged for his organizational brilliance and skills, but the women's sense were always clubbed together with male sense as their dependents. As I have observed elsewhere, we always talk of Mahadaisa of Chakradhar, Jani of Namya, Little Muktai of Dhyaneshwar, Bahinabai of Tukaram. This is a classic instance of how the hegemonic order manages to reappropriate emancipatory drives for its own legitimization. As a result, as late as 1957, Neera Desai acknowledged the Bhakti movement as an important movement, but concluded that the Bhakta's total conception of woman's status was not quite free from the admixture of then prevailing attitude towards womanhood. Hence, in her opinion, the overall effect of the movement on the woman was rather limited. During the 1980s, in the overall context of the gender politics, the second wave women's movement in India, there seems to be a proliferation of scholarly writings of Sant women. A.K. Ramanujan in 1973 translated love poems and published the classical Tamil anthology. In 1989, he talked extensively about Sant women in an interview for Manushi. He began studying the detailed history of Mahadevaika, a Veerasaiva woman, and an extraordinary picture emerged before his eyes. He saw marriage as an issue in the lives of Indian women since, in a way, it was not for male sons, both upper and lower caste. He saw women going through 5 phases: early dedication to God in the form of a particular deity, denial of marriage, defying social norms, initiation by the Guru, and marrying the Lord. The upper caste male's battle is with the system as a whole, often internalized as the enemy within, whereas the woman's son's struggle is with the family and family values. The woman's son remains feminine because she has nothing to shed, neither physical prowess, nor social power, nor purity, not even spiritual pride. She is already where she needs to be in these sons' legends. Since Bhakti movements, radical in the beginnings, eventually got routinized, Ramanujan suggested that the Sant writings have to be constantly reinterpreted and rescued from domestication that they undergo. In his opinion, Bhakti movements do offer alternatives, humane and creative ways of being and acting. Hence, he gave immense importance to the lives and poems of women's sons, for studying Indian women's voices, for finding alternative conceptions in the Indian civilization. Jayant Lele, in his edited work on Bhakti movements, makes pertinent observations about women's sense in the context of tradition-modernity debate. He argues that when Dharma speaks only as an oppressive movement, as a duty from which the joy of performance has been stolen, it becomes coercive. He sees Sant women's rebellious posture vis-a-vis the social order in the current context of their reality as a communally exchange young brides in an alien patriarchal patrilocal family in an often hostile household. According to him, women's son's love transcended the prison gates of legitimized duty, false modesty, enforced honor and oppressive kinship. Section 5. Contemporary interpretation of women's writing of past. In the 1980s, feminist scholars of the second wave of the women's movement were grappling with an extremely troubled situation in India. The statistics of deteriorating women's status, the experience of women's overall victimization, and sexual exploitation complicated by the locations in different communities, castes, classes, and absence or invisibility of women's collective resistance in the historical narratives, an urgent need of writing cultural historiography in order to combat naturalizing or essentializing the woman question. All these presented immense complexities. A nuanced understanding of the recasting of Indian women during colonial period was attempted. This also led to researching women in early India and challenging the myth of golden age. The search for women's voices in Indian history sought to make them audible as specifically women's voices. This was the context within which women's sons' lives and writings were foregrounded and studied by feminist scholars of different ideological dispositions. In the late 1980s, feminism emerged as a critique of biologism and sexual division of labor. It rested on the assertion of the right to chosen political affiliation and social identities above birth-bound ones. Women's membership of any community or even of the state was seen as problematic due to the patriarchal modes. The roots of misogyny were rightly traced to traditional as well as modern male-dominated cultures. The stereotypical abuse of weaker sex, along with deep-seated phobic anxiety about the woman's body and its reproductive ability, was critically analyzed by feminist scholars and activists. Sexism was defined as a process providing a rationale for the disempowerment of women in all spheres of life, secular and spiritual. In this milieu, it is not surprising that the special issue of Manashi, celebrating its 11th year, sought to resurrect women's sense as exercising individual's choice and creating alternative tradition. Women's sense were seen as extraordinarily courageous and creative women who asserted their right to their own life as they defined it. The writing was seen as a celebration of their individual choice and the religious path as an escape from the narrow confines of domesticity. Uma Chakravarti situates gender relations within the context of caste, class, and delineates the issue of the control of female sexuality as a central issue. Chakravarti acknowledges bhakti as rich tradition, particularly significant for women for both variations and commonalities in its social and religious implications. Here, the dominant Brahminical ritual is an attempted to be turned upside down, boundaries operating in the social world collapse, and the shackles imposed by the rigidly hierarchical social order are stretched to provide breathing space for some men and women. She warns against homogenizing bhakti into a neat unified tradition and simplifying its social content, and suggests that the extent to which bhakti dissolves gender lines needs to be investigated further. Kumkum Sangari provides an analysis of bhakti. Thus, in an economy where the labor of women and the surplus production of the peasant and artisan are customarily and naturally appropriated by the ruling groups, high Hindu traditions sought to encompass and retain the management of spiritual surplus and to circumscribe its availability along lines of caste and gender. In this spiritual economy, the liberalizing and dissenting forms of bhakti emerge as a powerful force which selectively uses the metaphysics of high Hinduism in an attempt to create value grounded in dailiness of material life within the reach of all. Susi Tharu and K. Lalita, compiling an anthology of women writing in India, argue that we might indeed learn to read them not for the moments in which they collude with or reinforce dominant ideologies of gender, class, nation or empire, but for the gestures of defiance or subversion implicit in them. Tharu observes a part of devotion set up no barriers of caste or sex. The women poets of the Bhakti movements do not have to seek the institutionalized spaces religion provided to express themselves, and the women's poetry moved from the court and the temple to open spaces in the field and the workplace and the common woman's hearth. Tharu and Lalita do acknowledge Sant women's writing as expressing a new sense of self-worth, new dignity to domestic chores, new confidence, and even their access to wider world, but note that their options were limited. They too doubt whether patriarchal controls were radically questioned and the lives of ordinary women changed. Vijaya Ramaswamy's work, Walking Naked, Women, Society, Spirituality in South India, appeared in 1997, mapping the spiritual history of women in the context of social structures through historical time and space. Her study looks into the issues of gender inequalities in the context of dominance and power and the debates over female sexuality and education. In Marathi, Indumati Shevde's Sant Kaviyatri, published in 1989 under the guidance of Suma Chitnis, the editor of the series of the book Sri Muktyache Maharashtratil Paulkhana, it was, in the Shevde's own words, an effort to search for the seeds of contemporary women's movement in the past in order to create an understanding of the struggles of contemporary women in search of the self. During those years, I too was engaged in researching the complex weave of Sant women's compositions in Maharashtra. Man-woman relations in the writings of Sant poetesses, written in 1991, is an effort to show how women's sons were talking differently as women and hence even as sons. Marathi literature as a source for contemporary feminism. Bhagwat argues that feminist movement in Maharashtra state ignored its own tradition of a succession of women's sons and other women writers who had inverted and occasionally even subverted the classical ideals of womanhood embodied in the hegemonic text. The movement paid a price for its failure. It appeared to be based on dry, abstract ideas lacking roots in soil. The last decade has posed special challenges to feminist scholarship in India, and new directions and issues have opened up. As Rajeshwari Sundararajan has argued, feminist scholarship moved from victimization of women to resistance, and agency of women has emerged in the context of majoritarian religious politics and its mobilization of women, and the failure of the state and its laws to ensure women's safety or rights. The other important context of 1990s, at least in Western India, has been the challenge posed by Dalit Bahujan feminist perspective and organization to feminist and non-Brahmin historiography and epistemology. These challenges have led us to reflect on questions like what constitutes resistance, can the resistance to patriarchies and Brahmanism caste hierarchies be neatly separated even if only for analytical purposes. We are impelled to reflect on what we hide when we privilege the voices of women's sense as voices of female resistance as if they are unmarked by the caste location. Soraya Bai, a Mahar Sant, questioned untouchability. Oh God, every human being carries impurity along with purity. Then why should some human beings be treated as untouchables? A Janabai, a bonded slave as a Dasi, that too of a Shudra caste, consciously stated, I am low born and kept outside the temple. Her declaration that Chokha Mela, the Mahasant, was only true Vaishnava is important in her understanding as a member of the Varkari community. When we read their voices as voices of specifically female resistance, we edit out the fact that early feminism in India had Dalit Bahujan beginnings, and these women were resisting the principles of Brahminical patriarchy. In fact, their consciousness expressed through their poetry spanned different locations of gender and caste, and thus offered a universalist and humanist critique of oppression. No doubt there have been important feminist historical research and emancipatory interpretations of the life of the woman since. However, the caution that most feminists express about reading too much into these voices may at least partially be explained by the fact that there has been very little work on the living tradition. The meaning that these women's sons have in the lives of contemporary Bahujan women, as well as the co-option of egalitarian tradition by the latter, needs documentation. The imprint of egalitarian practices from Varkari movement in the literature of the early decades of the 20th century are apparent, for instance, in the autobiographical accounts of Dalit women. I would suggest, therefore, that essentialization of Sant's women's writing, as women's writing has often rendered invisible the resistance to Brahminical patriarchy, and this needs to be brought to the foreground. I do not suggest thereby there is some ready-made indigenous Dalit Bahujan feminist solution in Sant women's writing that can deal with multiple patriarchies of the contemporary situation. Analysis of Bahinabai's contributions can help to explicate the argument in this context. As Dilit Chitre notes, the crisis that arose in Bahinabai's life was noted simply as bhakti of the god versus duties of the Pativata kind. Her struggle was a complex weave of questions of Varna hegemony, self-perception of Brahmanism, true meaning of the Veda and the discipline of ritualism. This Marathi Brahmin woman changed the conservative frame of mind of her husband, redefined the concept of Prativata Dharma from loyalty to pursuing a higher goal for both men and women, and chose a Shudra Guru and actively participated in the Varkari Sampradaya. In university courses in Marathi literature, we are taught to read her text and underline her skills in drawing a balance between the fulfillment of wifely duties and achievements of spiritual excellence. The context of her times was thus completely lost. She thus redefines the concept of a Brahman not as born but as one who understands truly Brahma, and that truth is universal for the whole humanity. Bahina challenges Brahmanical patriarchy through a subversion of meanings of pillars of coercive duties. Her Brahman is karma, that is active intervention. Wifely duty for her is recognizing her own self, and she takes a Shudra Guru and challenges the very presence of God in Brahmanism. Bahinabai lived on for many years after her husband's death and worked till the end of the suffering of the Varkaris. She actually managed to convert her husband to the Varkari sect and persuaded him to accept Tukaram as his guru. I suggest that the women's sense were very much part of the struggle of the early modernity of India, and hence the struggles and negotiations which in their cultural context will have to be understood and reinterpreted as emancipatory cultural histories. Drawing them out solely as women's voices often excludes their agency in challenging political priesthood of their time and blurs their historical relevance as early voices against Brahmanical patriarchy. Maharashtra and women writing today. Finally, I would like to conclude this by stating that a lot is happening in Marathi literature as far as women's writing is concerned. Many women writers are writing bravely, openly and in different genres. They write plays, short stories, long stories, poems, novels and even essays. They appear on various channels and are actively participating in different political parties, and truly there is a lot of visibility and presence for women across caste and classes and communities. In short, ghettoizing women's writing and magazines as a limited world of women by women, of the women and for the women will not do any justice to the contemporary world of writing of women. Essentializing women is a dangerous trap of identity politics, and we need to be wary of this danger. For a long time, one question haunts my mind. In the earlier time, Tarabai Shinde ended her life alone, almost like a crazy mad woman. Pandita Ramabai, with so much brilliance, ended up in Khedgaon, almost in the ashram, very lonely as if in exile without much support. Anandibai Joshi, after having succeeded in her achievement in the medical field, faced illness and ended her life without completing her mission as a doctor who wanted to use her knowledge and provide services to her sisters. I see a similar pattern in almost every decade. Women who dare to intervene in the Indian context in the rigid framework of patriarchal structures end up either in insanity, suicide or infantilization. As a result, in India, women's creative contribution is invariably invisibilized, or if recognized, they must have the sanction of great dynasty and the upper caste background. Recently, we witnessed Ajita Kale, Marathi writer living in US who hanged herself tragically at a very young age. Priya Tendulkar, a sharp, eloquent short story writer who died untimely. Gauri Deshpande, a committed woman writer with a liberal perspective, died due to alcoholism. All these creative writers, including Kamal Desai, never wanted to be counted as women writers because they felt that this would lower their literary capability and evaluation. Thus, the urgent need right now is for far more projects like these which read literary text in their own and our own context, each seeking to illuminate the other, and for those with an explicit pedagogic intent so as to make women's writing a critical site for the production of new knowledge and beginnings of a new feminist consciousness. In this module on women's writing and women's life, many of these issues have been raised, especially concepts relating to women writing, oral and written literature, transformative politics, social history, bhakti literature. What is very important that this module has really focused on the importance of social history and has led to a sensitive understanding of feminist understanding of women's expressions, especially in terms of the creative writing. Further, we have also understood how culture structures, frames and constraints women's voices and expressions.